Everyone believed her husband died naturally because that is what the body seemed to say at first glance, and that is exactly why this case fooled neighbors, relatives, doctors, and even police officers for weeks, because nothing about the death screamed murder. There was no blood, no broken bones, no signs of struggle, no suicide note, no forced entry, and no obvious poison. The man was found lying peacefully on his bed in his own house at 6:20 in the morning by his wife, who screamed loud enough to wake the entire street. She said she tried to wake him, but he was cold. She said his eyes were open wide, staring at the ceiling, and she thought he had suffered a sudden heart attack during sleep. And that explanation satisfied almost everyone, including the first responding officer and the general physician who came to certify death. The death certificate initially read natural causes, suspected cardiac arrest, but science does not care about emotions, reactions, or convincing stories. Science cares about details that most people ignore, and it was those details that slowly began screaming that this death was not natural at all. The man was 42 years old, physically active with no history of heart disease, no diabetes, no hypertension, no smoking habit, and he had gone for a morning walk just the day before, according to CCTV footage from a nearby grocery store. His gait was normal, his posture upright, his breathing unlabored, and he even joked with the shopkeeper. None of that matches sudden, unexplained death during sleep in a healthy adult. But that alone is not enough to challenge a death certificate. The first red flag was his eyes, because when the forensic medical officer finally examined the body during routine autopsy procedure, he noticed that the eyes were unusually bulged, not mildly prominent, but distinctly protruding beyond the orbital margins, something that does not happen in normal cardiac death during sleep. Many viewers think bulging eyes means strangulation only, but that is a myth. Bulging eyes means sudden increase in venous pressure inside the head and neck, something that happens when breathing is obstructed while the heart is still pumping, and that immediately narrows causes to asphyxial deaths, not cardiac arrest. The second red flag was petechia, tiny pinpoint hemorrhages around the eyelids and upper cheeks that were faint but present, and petechia do not occur in heart attacks. They occur when small blood vessels burst due to acute pressure rise, which again points toward asphyxia. And the third red flag was the tongue, which was slightly protruded and congested, and many people think tongue biting only happens in seizures, but tongue protrusion happens when oxygen is suddenly cut off and the body struggles reflexively. These are not dramatic movie signs. These are subtle scientific clues that only trained eyes catch, and that is why everyone else missed them, including the wife who slept beside him the entire night, or at least claimed she did, because science also noticed livor mortis, the purplish discoloration of blood settling after death, and the pattern of lividity was not matching a person who died lying flat on his back, because the lividity was more pronounced on one side of the neck and face, suggesting his head had been tilted or compressed for some time before death, and then repositioned, and that single observation destroyed the entire story of peaceful sleep death, because livor mortis fixes within hours and cannot be changed by moving the body later, meaning whatever position caused that pattern happened at the time of death, not after. And this is where science separated truth from theater. The wife said she found him lying straight on his back with eyes open, but the body said otherwise. The body said pressure was applied to the neck region in a specific way, not strong enough to fracture the hyoid bone, not strong enough to leave finger marks, but strong enough to block venous return while arterial flow continued, leading to rapid brain congestion, oxygen deprivation, panic reflex, and death within minutes. This is known medically as partial neck compression, and it leaves almost no visible external marks, especially if a soft object is used, like a pillow, a folded bedsheet, or even a forearm. And this method is terrifyingly effective and silent, and is one of the most commonly missed homicide mechanisms in domestic deaths. The autopsy then revealed congestion of lungs, frothy fluid in airways, and dark fluid blood, all signs of asphyxia, not myocardial infarction. The heart itself was structurally normal, coronary arteries patent, no plaque, no thrombosis, no rupture, and not completely ruled out heart attack, despite what everyone believed. And when science rules something out, emotions no longer matter. But the most chilling evidence came from toxicology because there was no poison detected, not even sedatives, which many murderers use to incapacitate victims. But here, none were found, meaning the victim was conscious during the event, which explains the extreme eye bulging and petechia, because those signs intensify when a conscious person struggles for air. And that detail alone made seasoned forensic experts pause, because it meant the man knew he was dying and could not fight back effectively. And then came the bedroom analysis. The pillow on the bed had abnormal compression marks, inconsistent with normal sleep, and microscopic fiber transfer from the victim's facial skin was found embedded deeper into the pillow, suggesting forceful, prolonged contact, not casual resting. And that is not something you can explain away with coincidences. And when investigators asked the wife to reenact how she found the body, her reenactment did not match the pillow indentation pattern because she placed it differently without realizing that pillows remember pressure patterns, and science reads them like fingerprints. And then there was the digital evidence, because while the wife claimed she was asleep the entire night, her smartwatch recorded movement at 2:14 a.m., a sustained period of elevated heart rate followed by inactivity, and the victim's phone recorded an unfinished voice command at 2:16 a.m., just 2 words caught by the microphone. Heavy breathing and the sound of fabric movement, and then silence. And those 2 words were enough to shatter any remaining doubt, because he said, "Stop, please," and no heart attack speaks those words. Science does not shout, it whispers, and only those who listen hear the truth. And in this case, science whispered loudly enough to expose a murder hidden behind tears, routine rituals, and a signed death certificate. And this was only the beginning of what science uncovered, because the deeper investigators went, the more the husband's death stopped looking like an accident and started looking like something carefully staged, but poorly understood by someone who underestimated what science sees when everyone else sees nothing. Science next turned to time because lies collapse fastest when time is measured accurately, and the wife's story depended entirely on timing. She said she slept at 11 p.m., woke at 6:20 a.m., and found him dead, cold, and unresponsive, meaning, according to her, he died quietly sometime in the night. But bodies do not lie about time of death, even when people do. And the first tool science used was body temperature, because human bodies cool at a predictable rate under stable conditions. And when the forensic team measured core temperature and adjusted for room temperature, bedding, body mass, and humidity, the estimated time of death fell between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., not anywhere near early morning discovery. And that already created a dangerous gap in her story, because it placed death squarely inside a time window when she claimed to be asleep beside him. But science went further, because temperature alone is never enough, and rigor mortis, the stiffening of muscles after death, was partially established in the jaw, neck, and upper limbs, but not fully fixed in the lower extremities, which again corresponds to a death roughly 4 hours prior to discovery, not 8 or 9 hours. And this pattern is textbook and reproducible, and cannot be faked or altered by human interference. And then came the gastric contents, because digestion follows a known timeline, and during autopsy, partially digested food was found in the stomach, consistent with a meal consumed around 9 p.m., which aligned with CCTV footage showing the couple eating dinner together. And digestion stage suggested death occurred approximately 3 hours after the meal, again pointing to early morning hours, not dawn. And that made the timeline collapse from multiple independent biological clocks, all pointing to the same truth. And when different systems agree, science listens. And then investigators looked at livor mortis again, because not only pattern but fixation time matters. And lividity was fixed, meaning the body had not been moved for at least 8 hours after death. Yet the wife claimed she shook him, tried to turn him, and screamed for help. But fixed lividity does not shift when you roll a body, meaning either she did not touch him as she said, or she touched him long after lividity sixed, which contradicts her discovery time. And this contradiction is not subjective, it is physiological and cannot be argued with emotion. And then came the issue of cooling, because she said the body was ice cold, but in a closed room with moderate temperature and thick bedding, a body does not become ice cold in 4 hours, especially not when another warm body is allegedly sleeping beside it. And this single claim exposed her, because exaggeration is a common psychological marker in false narratives, and science caught it instantly. And then investigators examined her statement again and noticed something subtle but devastating. She said she found his eyes open and mouth slightly open, but in asphyxial death, eyes are often wide open at the moment of death and remain so, while in natural sleep death, eyes are usually closed and gently relaxed, meaning her description accidentally matched the science of asphyxia, not cardiac arrest. And people who lie often borrow details they do not understand, and that is exactly what happened. And then came the alibi check, because she said she did not leave the house, but the front door smart lock recorded unlocking at 2:48 a.m. for 43 seconds and then relocking, and she explained it as panic, stepping out for air after finding the body. But that explanation fails because science already placed death before that time, and lividity fixation proved the body had not been moved or recently discovered then, and stepping outside after finding a body does not explain why the lock was opened when the death struggle was already over hours earlier. And then forensic psychology entered, because her statements showed temporal confusion. She mixed present and past tense when describing the discovery, which is common in fabricated memories, because real memories anchor in sequence, while fabricated ones float and shift, and science documents this pattern extensively. And then the neighbors reported hearing a muffled thud around 2:15 a.m., but dismissed it at the time, and that sound aligned perfectly with the voice command timestamp and smartwatch spike. And when independent evidence converges like this, coincidence disappears. And then investigators reconstructed the event minute by minute and found that death occurred while she was awake, interacting with her phone, and that she likely applied partial neck compression using bedding or forearm while straddling or leaning over, which would explain the pillow fiber transfer and lack of defensive injuries and absence of external marks, and absence of hyoid fracture because force was controlled and sustained, not violent and chaotic. And this is the kind of death that fools everyone except science, because it looks peaceful but is anything but. And by the end of part 2, the investigators no longer asked if this was homicide. They asked only one thing: how long had she planned it, and what mistake would finally expose her intent beyond physiology, because science had already proven when he died, how he died, and that he did not die alone or asleep, and the body had already testified more clearly than any witness ever could. Once science established how and when he died, the next step was motive, because while science does not need motive to prove homicide, it helps courts understand intent and patterns. And motive often hides in records people forget exist. And the first place investigators looked was money, because sudden, unexplained deaths are frequently followed by financial movements. And in this case, bank data revealed something unsettling. 3 weeks before his death, the wife had quietly changed the beneficiary on his life insurance policy from his parents to herself. And this was done online late at night from their home IP address, and the policy value was substantial enough to change a life. And when questioned, she said it was routine estate planning, but estate planning rarely happens without discussion. And messages recovered from his phone showed he had no idea the change was made, and it even sent a text to a friend 2 days before his death, saying he needed to talk to a lawyer about financial pressure at home. And that single sentence reframed the marriage from stable to strained. And then investigators examined email archives and found multiple unopened messages from debt collectors addressed to the wife, not the husband. And those debts were hidden credit lines taken in her name, but indirectly tied to his income and assets. And this mattered because sudden death would erase questions and unlock insurance. And science then stepped into psychology again, because people under financial stress exhibit patterns of planning behavior. And her browsing history showed searches like, how long does it take for a body to cool after death? What does a heart attack look like in sleep? Can someone die without marks on neck? And these searches were made over a period of months, not days, which eliminates panic searching and points toward rehearsal and preparation. And this evidence alone makes viewers' eyes widen, because most people do not realize how clearly search patterns reveal intent when examined over time. And then came the medical research. She accessed pages on asphyxia, strangulation, and positional suffocation, and particularly articles discussing lack of external injury when soft objects are used. And the timestamps of those searches aligned with nights when her husband was away on business, suggesting she researched without fear of discovery. And this is not speculation. This is logged digital evidence preserved by servers. And then investigators looked at her behavior after death, because grief also follows biological and psychological patterns, and hers did not fit. She was composed, overly detailed, and eager to provide explanations, which is a known red flag, because genuine shock often causes fragmented recall, not rehearsed narratives. And she repeatedly emphasized how peaceful he looked, which unconsciously aligns with the method used, because perpetrators often highlight the success of staging without realizing it. And then came forensic linguistics, because analysis of her emergency call revealed delayed emotional response. Her crying started after she began speaking, not before, and her breathing pattern was controlled, not erratic, which suggests performance rather than panic. And this analysis is not opinion. It is based on acoustic markers studied in thousands of real emergency calls. And then science returned to the body, because motive alone is never enough, and histological examination of neck tissues revealed microscopic hemorrhages deep in the sternocleidomastoid muscles, not visible externally. And these hemorrhages occur only when pressure is applied while circulation is active, meaning again the victim was alive and being compressed. And these micro-injuries cannot occur after death and cannot be caused by resuscitation because no CPR was attempted. And that finding sealed the mechanism of death beyond doubt. And then investigators re-examined the wife's claim that she tried to wake him and shook him, but the absence of nail marks, bruises, or skin displacement on his arms and torso contradicts vigorous shaking, because shaking a deceased body produces characteristic bruising patterns, especially in fragile post-mortem tissue, and none were present, meaning her attempt to wake him was either minimal or fictional. And then came the bed itself, because pressure mapping revealed two distinct compression zones on the mattress at the time of death, one consistent with the victim lying supine, and another consistent with a person leaning over him with concentrated weight distribution on knees or elbows. And this kind of analysis is rarely known to the public, but mattresses record pressure patterns like slow memory and can be reconstructed with modern tools. And this evidence made it impossible to argue she was merely sleeping beside him. And then investigators looked at her health data, because she wore a fitness tracker too, and at 2:12 a.m. her heart rate rose sharply and remained elevated for nearly 9 minutes. And physical exertion of that duration at night is not explained by sleep or panic discovery at 6 a.m., and it aligned perfectly with the duration required to cause asphyxial death without leaving marks. And when confronted with this, she said she woke briefly from a nightmare, but nightmares do not produce sustained exertional heart rates, and they do not coincide with another person's death, and science is merciless with such excuses. And then came witness science, because neighbors reported hearing a soft, rhythmic sound like bed movement, not loud enough to alarm, but unusual enough to be remembered, and this again aligned with struggle duration. And then investigators examined the husband's nails and found skin cells not matching his own under one fingernail, and those cells matched the wife's DNA, but not in a defensive scratch pattern, instead in a pressure contact pattern consistent with gripping fabric or forearm. And this subtlety matters because it shows proximity, not attack. And then, finally, came the moment science met the courtroom, because the defense tried to argue coincidence, technology error, stress misinterpretation, but science does not rely on one pillar, it builds a structure, and every pillar here supported the same truth. And by now, the question was no longer how did she kill him, but why she thought she would get away with it. And the answer lay in a common misconception that if there is no blood, no weapon, no visible injury, there is no crime. But science sees invisible forces, pressure, oxygen deprivation, circulation patterns, and time, and it does not forget. And by the end of part 3, the illusion of a natural death had completely collapsed under the weight of evidence that was never dramatic to look at, but devastating to understand. And viewers at this point realized something deeply unsettling, that the most dangerous crimes are not the loud, violent ones, but the quiet ones committed by people who believe they understand death better than science does.
By the time the case reached advanced forensic review, there was no mystery left for science, only resistance from narrative. Because when a story is repeated often enough, people begin to defend it emotionally, even against evidence. And this is where the case became uncomfortable, not just for the wife, but for everyone who had initially accepted the natural death explanation, including doctors, officers, and relatives. And science now turned to reconstruction, because reconstruction does not ask what someone says, it asks what must have happened for these findings to exist. And reconstruction showed something chillingly precise. The husband likely fell asleep on his back around midnight, breathing normally, heart rate low, muscles relaxed. And sometime after 2 a.m., the wife positioned herself beside him, not violently, not suddenly, but deliberately, and applied pressure in a way that blocked venous return from the brain while allowing arterial inflow, causing rapid congestion and panic without immediate loss of consciousness. And this explains why there was no wild struggle, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds, because the body's response to air hunger under controlled pressure is confusion, weakness, and gradual loss of motor control. And this is why the victim could only whisper, "Stop, please," instead of screaming. And this detail aligns with neurophysiology, because hypoxia first affects higher cortical function, speech becomes fragmented, judgment impaired, and then motor strength fades. And this is not speculation, it is documented in medical literature. And then science addressed a question viewers always ask: why didn't he fight back harder? And the answer is physiology, because when venous outflow is blocked, intracranial pressure rises rapidly, causing visual blackout, dizziness, and loss of coordination within seconds, and muscles weaken despite consciousness. And this creates the horrifying illusion of compliance, when in fact the body is failing, and this is why soft suffocation methods are so dangerous and misunderstood. And then investigators examined the absence of classic strangulation signs like fractured hyoid bone and concluded that pressure was applied higher and more diffusely, likely with bedding or forearm and not with hands around the neck. And this method leaves microscopic muscle hemorrhages but spares bone and cartilage and again matches findings. And then came forensic biomechanics, because the angle of pillow compression and mattress imprint suggested downward force from above, not lateral pressure from beside, meaning she was likely on top of him, using body weight. And this position explains why the pressure was sustained without visible fatigue, and why her fitness tracker recorded exertion, not because she was struggling, but because she was holding a position under stress, and that distinction matters. And then science confronted the wife's final defense, which was that if she had done this, there would be signs of oxygen deprivation in herself, dizziness, fainting, or injury. But science explains that the person applying pressure is not deprived of oxygen, only the person whose airway or venous flow is obstructed. And the exertion is similar to holding a plank position, which raises heart rate but does not cause hypoxia. And this defense collapsed immediately. And then came the laboratory evidence that made even seasoned professionals pause, because biochemical analysis of the victim's blood showed elevated catecholamines, stress hormones released during extreme fear and air hunger, and these levels were far higher than seen in sudden cardiac death, which is typically instantaneous and painless. And this chemical signature is invisible to the eye, but devastating in court, because it proves suffering and awareness at the time of death. And then investigators examined cortisol distribution in hair samples, which showed chronic stress in the weeks leading up to death, suggesting ongoing domestic tension and fear. And while this does not prove murder, it contextualizes it. And then came the wife's attempt to introduce an alternative theory, positional sleep apnea death. But science rejected this because sleep apnea does not cause petechiae, does not cause extreme eye bulging, does not produce prolonged conscious struggle or whispered pleas. And the lungs in sleep apnea deaths do not show the same frothy edema pattern seen here. And this is well documented. And then came courtroom science demonstration, because experts demonstrated on models how soft venous obstruction alone can cause death without airway blockage and without marks. And this demonstration is often shocking to juries because it contradicts common beliefs, and the judge allowed it because it was scientifically accurate. And then investigators addressed why she did not show visible injuries, because perpetrators often expect scratches, bites, or bruises, but in controlled asphyxia, the victim's hands lose coordination early, and nails may brush skin but not tear it, which matches the single undernail DNA finding. And then came the final reconstruction timeline, minute by minute, showing phone activity, fitness data, voice recording, mattress pressure, lividity fixation, gastric digestion, and histology, all aligning within a narrow window between 2:10 and 2:25 a.m. And when independent systems align so tightly, error becomes impossible. And this is the point where the illusion truly died, because no coincidence can explain this level of convergence. And by the end of Part 4, science had not only proven homicide, but had replayed it silently and precisely, without witnesses, without confession, and without drama. And this is what unsettles viewers most, because it shows that even when everyone is fooled, even when tears convince and appearances reassure, the body still remembers, and science still listens and records everything, waiting patiently for someone to ask the right questions.
The final stage of this case did not begin with an arrest. It began with silence, because once science finished speaking, there was nothing left for arguments. And investigators allowed the evidence to sit exactly as it was, because rushing would only give space for doubt. And when the wife was finally confronted, it was not with accusations, but with data, timelines, charts, and physiological facts laid out in calm, neutral language. Because science does not intimidate, it informs. And that approach is often more devastating than shouting. And she listened as experts explained how the body temperature cooling curve placed death hours before discovery, how livor mortis fixation proved the body had not been moved when she claimed, how the lungs showed signs of conscious air hunger, how microscopic neck hemorrhages proved pressure while circulation was active, how catecholamine levels revealed terror, not sleep, how the mattress remembered weight, how the pillow remembered force, how the smartwatch remembered exertion, how the phone remembered his last words, and how every independent system told the same story. And when confronted with this convergence, her responses slowed, her speech fragmented, and she began repeating phrases like, "I don't know," and "maybe I was wrong about the time," which is a known cognitive collapse response when fabricated narratives can no longer hold shape. And still she did not confess, because many perpetrators never do, believing silence is safer than truth. But science does not need confession, and the arrest came quietly, without spectacle, and the charge was murder by asphyxia. And during trial, the defense tried to reintroduce doubt by attacking individual pieces of evidence, saying technology can fail, bodies vary, science is not exact. But this argument failed because the prosecution did not rely on one piece, it relied on convergence. And convergence is the enemy of reasonable doubt, because while any single system can err, many independent systems aligning cannot. And the jury was walked through the case slowly, not emotionally but methodically, because shock alone does not convict, understanding does. And when jurors saw how each sign reinforced the next, their expressions changed, because they realized this was not about belief, but about physiology and time and forces invisible to untrained eyes. And one moment stood out, when the forensic pathologist explained that eyes do not bulge from surprise or fear alone. They bulge from pressure that traps blood in the head, and that this requires an active heart and blocked venous return. And that statement reframed the entire image of the body, from peaceful to panicked. And several jurors later said that was when they truly understood what had happened. And then the defense argued lack of motive, but the court reminded them motive is not required when mechanism, intent, and opportunity are proven. And intent was proven by preparation, searches, beneficiary changes, and controlled application of force. Opportunity was proven by presence and timeline, and mechanism was proven beyond doubt. And when the verdict came, it was unanimous, guilty, and sentencing followed, with the judge stating that the crime was particularly disturbing because it exploited common misconceptions about death and trust within intimacy. And that statement echoed what science had shown all along. And after conviction, the case was reviewed by medical boards because initial certification of natural death had failed, and this led to new protocols requiring deeper scrutiny in unexplained domestic deaths. And this is perhaps the most important outcome, because science not only solved a crime, it corrected a system and saved future lives and families. And the lesson here is not that anyone can be a killer, but that anyone can be fooled by appearances, and that death is not always dramatic, violent, or obvious. Sometimes it is quiet, calculated, and hidden behind routine. And the reason this case shocks viewers is because it forces a realization that science sees what eyes cannot, and that trust alone is not evidence, and that bodies speak in ways most people never learn to hear. And the husband's death fooled everyone except science, because science asked questions others did not. It measured instead of assuming, it listened instead of believing, and in the end it gave a voice to someone who could no longer speak. And that is the true power of forensic science. Not revenge, not spectacle, but truth, patiently assembled from fragments. And this case now stands in textbooks, not because it was sensational, but because it was subtle. And subtle cases are the most dangerous and the most important to understand, because if science had not intervened, this death would have remained a statistic, a natural cause, a closed file, and a perfect crime. And that is why this story matters, because it reminds us that the human body is the most honest witness there is, and even when everyone is fooled, it will still tell the truth to those trained to listen. And that truth cannot be erased, staged, or buried, no matter how carefully someone believes they planned everything.
The aftermath of this case extended far beyond the courtroom, because once the verdict was delivered, the story did not end. It spread quietly through medical circles, forensic conferences, police training rooms, and legal seminars, not as a sensational crime, but as a warning and a lesson. And science revisited every step, asking how many similar deaths had been misclassified, how many certificates had been signed too quickly, how many families had buried truth along with bodies. And the answer was uncomfortable, because experts admitted that without meticulous examination, this case would have been labeled natural forever. And that realization changed protocols in several jurisdictions, where sudden domestic deaths without clear medical history now require deeper scrutiny of eyes, neck lividity, timing, and digital data. And this is where viewers often feel unsettled, because they realize how thin the line is between truth and assumption, and how easily trust can override evidence. And the wife never gave a full confession, even after conviction. And that too is common, because when a crime relies on misunderstanding rather than violence, perpetrators often believe they were clever rather than cruel. But science stripped that illusion completely and showed that intelligence does not defeat physiology, and planning does not defeat convergence, and silence does not defeat data. And what makes this case uniquely powerful is not brutality, but subtlety, because nothing about the scene screamed danger, and that is exactly why it worked initially, and exactly why it now serves as a teaching case, because the signs were always there, just overlooked. And when people hear about bulging eyes, petechiae, lividity, fixation, microscopic hemorrhages, catecholamine surges, smartwatch data, pillow fiber transfer, they often think this is rare. But it is not rare, it is simply rarely noticed. And this realization makes viewers question how many deaths around them were accepted too easily. And that discomfort is healthy because science thrives on discomfort. It advances when certainty is challenged and assumptions are dismantled. And the husband's family later spoke about how they had believed the natural death explanation because it was easier emotionally, and because questioning it meant questioning someone they trusted. And that is another hard truth science exposes, that emotional comfort is often the enemy of truth, and loving someone does not make them incapable of harm. And none of this means suspicion should replace compassion, but it means evidence should always come before closure. And the final autopsy report in this case did not use dramatic language. It simply stated cause of death, asphyxia due to external compression, manner of death, homicide. And those words carry enormous weight because they represent the difference between forgetting and understanding, between assumption and proof. And the reason this story grips people is because it shows that science does not need witnesses, confession, or motive to speak. It only needs a body, time, and patience. And this is why the title remains accurate. Her husband's death fooled everyone except science, because science is not impressed by tears or reassured by calm voices. It looks at pressure, oxygen, blood flow, hormones, fibers, and timestamps. And when those elements align, truth becomes unavoidable. And the final lesson for viewers is simple but unsettling. Never underestimate what the body records. Never assume quiet means peaceful, and never believe that absence of injury means absence of violence, because the most convincing lies are the ones that match what people expect, and science exists to challenge exactly that. And this case continues to save lives, not by fear, but by awareness. Because once people understand how death actually works, it becomes much harder to hide behind myths and misunderstandings. And that is the quiet power of forensic science. And if this story made you see death investigation differently, if it shocked you not with gore but with facts, if it made you realize how much the body speaks, then this channel is for you, because every story here is about truth hidden in plain sight. So subscribe now for more real cases where science reveals what everyone else missed. And if this case changed your perspective, leave a comment below with what shocked you most, because your curiosity keeps these truths alive and shared.